Greetings and welcome to this week's episode of Bronx Bombers. My name is Joe Rubenstein and it is Thursday, July 4th. Happy birthday, America, as the Yankees quickly get back to their winning ways last night at Citi Field. Domingo Germán, fresh off the DL, IL, DL, whatever, was really spectacular. 6 innings, 1 run, 5 hits, no walks. Phenomenal. Didi and Don Giovanni go back-to-back, and Don Giovanni with just 2 stellar defensive plays at third base. What an asset he's been. And speaking of assets, DJ with a pair of doubles. What else is new? The guy's an absolute machine. So the Bombers have now won 14 of their last 16 and are the top dog in the American League. And with Boston and Tampa losing last night, the Yankees, as I record this a couple of hours before first pitch in Tampa, are back to that 6.5 game lead over the Rays and 11 over the Red Sox. Chris Sale got shelled last night by Toronto, and the Red Sox, their really fascinating, even groundbreaking decision to not have a functioning bullpen this year is biting them extremely hard in the keister, which is really and truly a terrible shame. You could You can follow us on Twitter at Bombers Podcast is the handle. You can also send us questions. We'll try to answer in our mailbag segment here on the podcast. You can like us on Facebook, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. We're on Spotify as well. And as always, you can send us your comments and questions via Twitter or Facebook. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. And just as a side note, I'm doing another podcast called Gotham Variety, which will present scripted audio dramas twice a month. We've got some really great actors and top-notch stories that we've put together, and that podcast debuts on September 1st, but we'll start releasing trailers next week. Just do a search for it wherever you're listening to this right now, and you'll find it, or you can check it out at GothamVariety.com. Coming up a little bit later on in our Twitter poll this week, some interesting results when we asked which Yankees, if any, were snubbed for the All-Star Game, and in just a minute, author Paul Goldberger rejoins the show for part 2 of our conversation about his terrific new book, Ballpark, Baseball in the American City. All that and more coming up on today's Bronx Bombers. Back in a moment.
Bronx Bombers Trivia. Which of the following players has worn the number 24 for the New York Yankees? Is it A, Tino Martinez, B, Ruben Sierra, C, Robinson Cano, or D, Jeff Nelson? The answer coming up a little bit later in the podcast.
All right, back here on Bronx Bombers, and our featured guest once again is Paul Goldberger, author of the great new book, Ballpark, Baseball in the American City. Paul is with us for part 2 of our conversation, which we begin with a question about the original Yankee Stadium. Since this is, after all, a Yankees podcast, let's get to the original Yankee Stadium. And that word stadium is very important because the team owners at that time, Jacob Ruppert and Cap Houston, explicitly wanted Yankee Stadium to evoke the kind of grandeur of the Roman Colosseum, right?
Yes, exactly. Yankee Stadium was the first ballpark that was actually called a stadium. And it was, as you've said, it was a very conscious attempt to evoke grandeur, not just architectural grandeur, but to kind of underscore the idea that this team is something, Olympian, something grander, something bigger than any other team. And therefore it deserves a more monumental home than any other team. And of course, they were also coming off many, many years of being the tenants of the Giants at the Polo Grounds. And the last few years were very unhappy landlord-tenant years, let's say, because the Giants were the dominant team when that relationship began. Then the Giants slipped somewhat. The Yankees made, of course, the famous hire of Babe Ruth, who quickly became the most popular player in baseball. Attendance was larger at the Polo Grounds for Yankee games than Giants games. The landlords were not happy to see their tenant do better than they did, and they wanted the Yankees out of there. The Yankees then, as you said, commissioned this building that was supposed to be grander and more monumental than anything else in baseball to underscore their view of themselves as, the sort of Olympian team in professional baseball.
Now, let's get into a couple of disasters which you cover in your book. Municipal Stadium, nicknamed the Mistake by the Lake, was another multi-purpose stadium where the Indians played from 1932 to 1993. And a different sort of disaster, or at least a qualified disaster, was Houston's Astrodome, which actually was cutting edge in many ways at that time. It was the first domed stadium. It was the first to install artificial turf. It was also the first to feature an animated scoreboard. Some of those are dubious firsts, but it was also a stadium with numerous problems. Talk about Municipal Stadium and the Astrodome, if you would, Paul, and their shortcomings architecturally and otherwise.
Well, very different problems and different stories, but equally unsuccessful, I think, for baseball. You're right. Municipal Stadium in Cleveland was the product of the city's desire to have a very large stadium as an important statement of sort of who they were as a city. Cleveland believed itself in the 1930s to be a worthy rival to New York or Chicago, and they thought, a stadium would be a perfect way to express that. The Indians at that point were playing in League Park, an old stadium that was kind of quaint, but in fact probably made Ebbets Field look like a palace. It was really pretty small and run down for most of its life. The Indians were also in an ownership transition and were not likely to we're not likely to be in a position to actually invest in a new ballpark themselves, even though this was a day when teams generally did pay for things themselves. The city didn't want to wait, and so the city said, we'll build it and we'll just lease it to you. So Cleveland Lakefront Stadium, Municipal Stadium, marked the beginning of two trends that were really not very good. One was the idea of a very large stadium designed expressly for multiple sports, which made it less favorable for baseball. And second, the idea of municipal public financing of stadiums rather than being financed by the teams. And so that's something that, of course, grew to dominate professional sports later. But its beginnings actually are in that decision Cleveland made in the 1930s. Because it had 80,000 seats. If the Indians attracted 20,000 people on an afternoon, that would have made League Park look pretty full and like a really good attendance and lively and good. Those same 20,000 people just disappeared in Municipal Stadium. And so they ended up going back to League Park for most of their regular day games and only playing weekend and holiday games at Municipal Stadium for several years. It's the only time, I believe, in Major League history that a team has had two official home ballparks at the same time. But they got permission from the league to sort of alternate depending on the day of the week and so forth. Then the Astrodome, a whole different set of problems. That was also, I guess, the result of a little bit of overreach by a city. In this case, Houston, which wanted to prove that it could be bigger and bolder and all that than any other place. But also, of course, it's a result of the evolution of baseball and the expansion into climates that baseball once had not been played in. So, it's a very, very different thing to ask people to sit outside in the Texas sun for 3 hours or more on a summer afternoon. So it's not surprising that when technology made it possible to actually do a dome that large, they decided they wanted to go for it and try it. In the end, it's actually a fabulous building and a terrible ballpark. It's a sort of wonderful, wild, crazy expression of Texas exuberance. It's fun to see like an indoor rodeo in there or some other crazy thing. I think you lose something very essential to baseball in the Astrodome, though. And I'm very glad that they have moved on to what is now called Minute Maid Park in downtown Houston, which is also a better location.
Now, between the early era of ballparks that we talked about, Wrigley, Fenway, Shibe Park, and the brand new development, let's call it the theme park era, which we'll get to in a minute, there were a couple of different phases. The post-war suburban phase, where ballparks were set far from city centers. I guess Dodger Stadium would be a prime example. And then in the 90s, a return to the city, exemplified by Camden Yards. But let's start with that post-war suburban phase. What prompted that? And what, in your view, Paul, were the positives and the negatives?
Well, the driving force behind the move to the suburbs was that, was the fact that everything else was going to the suburbs. And so why not baseball? It was about following the audience. And so much of the middle-class audience for baseball had gone to the suburbs. So it was really no different from, department stores moving into suburban malls and so many other things that were happening in those years. The sad thing, of course, is that ballparks that were once integrated into urban neighborhoods, places like Fenway and Wrigley or Ebbets Field, that you would walk to and feel connected to everything around them and would in fact bring and generate life for everything around them, instead became like these sort of beached whales sitting in the middle of a sea of parked cars on black asphalt. But, that was the 50s. And it took a while before we figured out that all came at a price. And in fact, while it may have had some convenience to it, it was often not very good. And we began to pull away, but not for some time. I mean, that's another part of the story. Those years brought us an awful lot of ballparks, and they also led to a degree of standardization that I think is what breaks from the tradition of baseball at least as much as moving out of the city did. So you had a time when Veterans Stadium in Philadelphia looked pretty much like Three Rivers Stadium in Pittsburgh, which looked like Riverfront in Cincinnati, which looked like Fulton County in Atlanta, and so forth and so on. Shea Stadium was at least a little better than some of them because it was not a full circle and didn't close at the end. It was more like a kind of big horseshoe, which I think is better because I like the idea that the outfield is sort of symbolically open in baseball, and even though you have bleachers, that your eye can go to the sky beyond and a sense of open space. But some of them were complete enclosed circles, which is, for me, very un-baseball-like. Thankfully now, just about all of those are gone. The only thing from that era two things from that era remain. One is Oakland, the Oakland Coliseum, the only mixed-use stadium still in use. And the other is actually the funny exception from that period, which is Dodger Stadium, which is, it's all wrong in one sense in that it is only reachable by automobile and, in fact, is a nightmare to get into and get out of. However, it is one of the very few things from that era that was built for baseball only, not as a mixed-use stadium. It very much serves the needs of baseball. And once you actually finally make it through the traffic and get into your seat, it is one of the nicest, most satisfying places in all of Major League Baseball to actually attend a game. Problem is, of course, then you also have to get home, which is the same experience in reverse. But when you're in it, it is absolutely fabulous.
And then Camden Yards debuted in 1992, inaugurating what I guess you could call the retro or maybe neoclassical phase. I remember when it opened, it was a cause for great celebration. It's a ballpark that is justifiably hailed as one of the most enlightened and beautiful around. Talk about the development of Camden Yards, the impetus, to why it was constructed, and what made it so important and so influential.
Well, Camden Yards sort of single-handedly broke the stranglehold that the concrete donut had on baseball. And it came about in a sort of a happy accident. The Baltimore Orioles were run by a man named Larry Lucchino, who had grown up in Pittsburgh and had very, very fond memories of Forbes Field. And he was not fond of Memorial Stadium in Baltimore where the team played. And then when the owner who'd hired him, Edward Bennett Williams, died just after, by the way, making a commitment to, or agreeing on a set of commitments with Baltimore and the state of Maryland to build a new ballpark to keep the Orioles in Baltimore. He then died, and the team was sold to an investor from New York named Eli Jacobs, who in fact just happened to be a big architecture buff. And he was the kind of guy, had no professional connection to architecture, but he just loved it and loved to talk about it. And he had grown up in Boston and had very fond memories of Fenway Park. And the two of them basically said to the architects who came and presented their first scheme, which was another concrete donut that looked like all the others, said, no, we don't want this. And we want something that feels much more like those old ballparks from our childhood. And the architects were smart enough, I think, to realize that if they didn't want to lose the job, they'd better do that. It was a firm called HOK, the sport division of HOK, a big international architecture firm, which later broke away and became its own independent firm called Populous, and they're still very much around and doing a lot of important work. In any event, they quickly kind of got religion, and they produced a much more traditional-looking ballpark that was closely integrated into the city, and they then started doing that all over the place and became huge proselytizers for the idea of the traditional ballpark. It's interesting you use the term retro, which I know a lot of people do, and it's quite common. I'm not that fond of it, only because it suggests that those ballparks are entirely traditional. And in fact, while some of them, including Camden Yards, do have a certain amount of old-fashioned decorative detail around them, they're also very modern buildings in a lot of ways. And, they're a little bigger than the really old ballparks because they have lots of bathrooms, clubs and lounges, and lots of eating options and all the things that people today demand, much bigger locker rooms and training facilities, all the other things that you would have seen in one of the big concrete donuts, but just in a warmer, more inviting kind of package. And also that one of the key aspects of them is that they integrate well into their surroundings. But they don't necessarily have to have very traditional architectural detail. And in fact, shortly after finishing Camden Yards, those same architects did Jacobs Field, which is now called Progressive Field in Cleveland, which is a wonderful ballpark. It replaced the deservedly maligned Municipal Stadium. And it doesn't really have much traditional detail at all. It's a much more modern building. And over the years, they've gone on to do a number of others that kind of mix traditional and modern elements. So it's more than just retro.
Now, as I mentioned, you point out in your book that we seem to be entering a new era where recent ballparks, specifically SunTrust Park in Atlanta, which opened just 2 years ago, rather than connecting to an actual city, these are really more like theme parks. They're almost their own miniature cities, which extend into the surrounding areas, as you put it, blurring the distinction between the real city and the artifice of the ballpark. And this is the plan, actually, for the new ballparks that are being built as we speak for the Rangers and the Oakland A's. Talk about this new development, if you would, Paul, this theme park concept.
Now, what we've seen in Atlanta, I have to say, is sort of troubling. It's really a make-believe city. It's a real estate development outside the city in Cobb County, about 15 miles from downtown. And it has a sort of, pretend street with bars and restaurants. There's a couple of condo buildings, there's stores, there's even a hotel and an office building. It's a pleasant place to walk around in, but it's kind of like a mall. It's not a real city with all the mixture of a real, true public city. And the anchor structure at the end of it is, in fact, the ballpark. And it's a pretty decent ballpark. The ballpark itself is not the problem. It's the way in which it does this. Now, it's also true that Turner Field was in a really lousy site in downtown Atlanta. It was not terribly feasible for various reasons to improve it and do other things there. I'm just sorry that the team was not able to or did not want to find another downtown site and do something else there. But the trend is one that we're seeing play out in somewhat different ways too. And what the Braves really wanted was to control and earn money from things outside the gates of the ballpark as well as inside. And that's really what's behind all this. And we're seeing that now happen in a lot of other teams that are, in fact, in real urban areas. For example, the St. Louis Cardinals, who have Busch Stadium, which was rebuilt a few years ago. It's actually an excellent ballpark and a wonderful downtown location in the heart of St. Louis, next door to the former downtown ballpark, the earlier Busch Stadium. And they have now developed the site of the prior one across the street as what they call Ballpark Village, which is, again, bars, restaurants. There's even a little museum of the team, and there'll be condos, so you can live there as well. I mean, all this is not bad. It's fine. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, and I guess for the team to want to earn money beyond its gates, if that makes baseball more viable, whatever, I guess is my view. But and I'm certainly happier seeing that as part of St. Louis than what we see in Atlanta, where they did all that way out as a little separate thing. At least in Atlanta, it's still all, at least in St. Louis, it's all connected to the real city, and the life of the real city still kind of goes on around it, even if the thing is a little bit theme parky, Ballpark Village. Nevertheless, whatever. But Atlanta also raises another problem that's troubling to me, which is that, Cobb County, where this was done, is the only county in metropolitan Atlanta area that is not part of the regional transit system. You can really only get there by car. And if you're a poor African-American kid who lives downtown, you can't really get to a ball game anymore. And I think what they were really doing is saying that they're well-to-do suburban residents were their market, and they don't care about anyone else. It's not an accident that in Atlanta now, the professional soccer team, which does play downtown, has become, I believe, the most successful pro soccer team in America now, because I think they're attracting a lot of the audience that the Braves have given up on when they moved out to the suburbs.
Okay, final question, Paul, and you've been really generous with your time. We really appreciate it. We have two relatively new ballparks here in New York, the new Yankee Stadium and Citi Field.
Only time in the history of baseball that two ballparks have opened in the same city at the same time.
That's exactly right. So give us your capsule architectural critique of these two parks, if you would, and where they fit in this ongoing evolution of ballparks.
They're very different, I think. They are very different. Citi Field is an urban ballpark in search of an urban setting. It's out there next to where Shea Stadium had been. For me, it's actually a nice ballpark that, like many of the ones that followed in the wake of Camden Yards, learns from it, builds on it, has many of those same qualities of Camden Yards, and is a vastly pleasanter place to see a ball game than Shea Stadium was. Yankee Stadium, I think, probably was built in the right place. I would have preferred that Citi Field go to Long Island City if it was going to stay in Queens, or maybe to the Hudson Yards area of Manhattan, which would have given it a tighter connection to a real urban fabric. But Yankee Stadium sort of has that, and I think, the new stadium is okay. I find it a little bit pompous and self-conscious, and a little pretentious. On the other hand, I so hated the way Yankee Stadium had been renovated in the 1970s, which I think was one of the worst renovations of any ballpark anywhere. They took one of the greatest of all historic ballparks ever and did all they could to make it look like an anonymous concrete donut from the 70s, at which point, there's no reason to save it anymore. Better to start all over again, in my view. Had Yankee Stadium existed in its original form, then I think I would have felt very, very strongly that it should have been preserved and given a gentle, respectful updating the way Wrigley and Fenway and Dodger Stadium had had. But we didn't have that option, and it had been ruined so badly, might as well start over. And it's a nicer place to go to a ball game than the prior iteration from the 70s, but I find it a little overblown, a little pretentious, and not as welcoming as Citi Field. So that's my take on those two.
I'm just curious, pretentious in what way? I mean, I think I know what you mean, but...
I guess I mean, no, you're right to call me on that, because maybe it's not the best choice of words. I guess I mean kind of self-consciously grandiose, okay? I mean, that front door kind of looks like it's practically waiting for the Pope to make some ceremonial entrance through or something like that, But, look, it plays on the Yankees' image of themselves as a team and what they have sort of tried to present, which is certainly historically accurate because, of course, it's what Jacob Ruppert was doing when the original Yankee Stadium was built in 1923. Was trying to send that same message that we are kind of the monumental team in baseball.
All right, Ballpark, Baseball in the American City by Paul Goldberger. Pick it up. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, your local indie bookstore, if they still have those. It's a fascinating journey full of insights. I couldn't put it down. And it also, by the way, has some truly remarkable photographs. Paul, you did some amazing, really unique work with this book, and thanks so much for being part of the show. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Joe. It's been fun.
All right, we'll come back. More Bronx Bombers in just a moment.
And now the answer to today's Bronx Bombers trivia question. Which of these players, Tino Martinez, Ruben Sierra, Robinson Cano, or Jeff Nelson, wore the number 24 for the New York Yankees? The answer? A. Tino Martinez. And now, here's Joe with this week's Twitter poll.
Yes, this week's Twitter poll results are in. We asked you this. Were Gleyber Torres and Luke Voit unfairly snubbed for the All-Star game? And 28% of our followers on Twitter at Bombers Podcast said Gleyber was snubbed, 10% said Luke Voit was snubbed, 58% said both, and 4% said neither. And I'm sort of merging the mailbag segment into this Twitter poll segment here, because this week's question from Glenn in Denver was basically, why didn't Luke Voit make the cut? And I'll address that a little later on. So I have a horrible confession to make, which is that I have never in my life cared about the All-Star game. All I care about really is that, no Yankee who happens to play in it gets hurt. Even as a kid, I didn't care about it. Actually, I don't think I've ever seen one all the way through. I mean, maybe it's just, the sight of the Yankees and Red Sox in the same lineup that summons my gag reflex. Maybe it's that every award system in the universe is somehow flawed, it seems to me. Maybe it's that the game means absolutely nothing, at least not anymore. There was that brief window, remember, actually not so brief, between 2003 and 2016, where the All-Star game decided home field in the World Series. Truly moronic. But Major League Baseball came to their senses on that one. But my personal feelings aside, I know some of you do enjoy the game. The Bombers that made the cut this year as starters in the All-Star game, which will be played on Tuesday in Cleveland, are, first of all, Gary Sanchez, who has 23 home runs, trailing only Encarnacion in the American League, who has 24. Christian Yelich, by the way, leads baseball with 31, but, and this isn't to take anything away from Yelich, who's having a ridiculous year for Milwaukee, but he's had 83 more plate appearances than Gary Sanchez, okay? And Gary leads all of baseball in at-bats per home run. Every 10.5 at-bats, Gary Sanchez hits a home run. He's also shown some real improvement defensively, which I've talked about. I think a lot of that has to do with, he's in better health, first of all, and he's lost some weight. Also making the starter squad on Tuesday, the miraculous DJ LeMahieu, the machine, my favorite current Yankee. And DJ, if the season ended today, would be the batting champion with his .342 average. He also leads the American League league in singles with 75, and as I said, he had a pair of doubles last night, and he's been stellar defensively as well, although he did have a costly error in the first game against the Mets on Tuesday. There are no Yankee hitters on the reserve squad, and so that's where the controversy lies, and that's what led to my poll, which we'll get to in a second. As far as pitching, Aroldis Chapman, who's currently tied for the league lead in saves with 23, he's tied with Brad Hand of the Indians. Aroldis is sporting a minuscule 1.36 ERA, and he is the only Yankee on the pitching roster, and I think that's correct. So obviously, all three guys, Sanchez, DJ, and Chapman, very deserving. So let's get to Gleyber, who very belatedly today was assigned to the reserve team after first Tommy La Stella was injured and replaced by Brandon Lau, and then Lau got injured last night, so Gleyber is his replacement. But Gleyber, who could actually have been selected at either second base or shortstop, he's played both this year. But as we said, DJ got the nod to start at second base correctly, and the starting shortstop will be the Twins' Jorge Polanco. So far, so good. Those are both utterly deserving. But the reserve shortstop chosen was Cleveland's Francisco Lindor, and this I and many others had a big problem with. The fact is, Gleyber's offensive numbers are clearly better than Lindor's. Gleyber has 19 home runs, Lindor has 12. Gleyber's hitting .298, Lindor .291. Gleyber's on-base percentage is .363, Lindor .350. Gleyber also has a significant lead in slugging, .544 to .494. So his OPS, combined on-base and slugging, is a superb .908. Lindor, .842. Very good, but 66 points lower. And perhaps most impressive, Gleyber is hitting .412 with runners in scoring position. He and DJ LeMahieu absolutely excel in that area. And as far as fielding, I mean, Gleyber's ultimate zone rating, that's become kind of the sabermetric defensive stat that's most often used. He's within just a couple of points of Lindor. And if you're a fan of the wins above replacement stat, which I often make fun of, but some people take it seriously, Gleyber comes in at 2.6 and Lindor at 2.2. So yes, Gleyber, although as I said, he's been belatedly assigned to the reserve team, should have gotten the nod at the outset over Francisco Lindor. Now, to get to Glenn's question about Luke Voit, who is the latest Yankee to go on the injured list, joining Giancarlo Stanton, which is a shame with Stanton, because in those few games that Giancarlo played, he was just scorching hot. But we won't see Stanton again till August, and Voit suffered an abdominal strain over in England while running out one of what seemed like 500 Yankee doubles in those two. I won't call them games. They were really just offensive extravaganzas for both teams. So Mike Ford replaces Voit on the roster, although, of course, Encarnacion will be his replacement for the most part at first base. The Yankees hoping to have Voit back right after the All-Star break for the Toronto series. So starting at first base in the All-Star game will be Carlos Santana, who's having a great year. I don't think even the most extreme Yankee partisans think that's a bad call, but the reserve is Jose Abreu of the White Sox, and here's where it gets interesting. Personally, I think Voit is having a better year offensively. In fact, I know he is. I mean, facts don't lie. Batting average, Voit .280, Abreu .268. On-base percentage, Voit .393. That leads the team, by the way. Abreu .309. That's not an insignificant difference, guys. That's a chasm right there. And slugging is closer. Voit at .509, Abreu at .508. But again, OPS, Voit is elite at .901. Abreu just very good at .817. Yes, Abreu has 2 more home runs with 19 to Voigt's 17, but so what? I mean, those other numbers I cited more than supersede the 2 home run difference. Now, defensively, neither is great, but Voit is certainly improved over last year, so that's a wash to me. But given that major difference in on-base percentage, and again, if you care about wins above replacement, Voigt's at 1.7, Abreu's at 0.9. Honestly, this was as much of a snub as Gleyber, in my opinion. So yes, Glenn, Luke Voit, although obviously he wouldn't have been able to play He's injured, but it's still an honor to be chosen, and he should have definitely been chosen over Abreu as the reserve first baseman. So my answer to my own poll is that I am with the 58% that said both were snubbed, really kind of screwed in broad daylight, if we're going to be honest about it. I think, part of the problem here is that Major League Baseball, and it's the only one of the four major American sports that does this, mandates that at least one All-Star be chosen from every team. I do not like that rule. I dislike any rule, actually, where merit is bypassed for something as random as what uniform the player happens to wear. I mean, I get that fans of a certain team might be bummed out if they don't have one of their own guys to root for at the All-Star game, but remember, unless every team has at least one All-Star caliber player, somebody's getting screwed out of their rightful place as a result of that mandate. So whoever in Major League Baseball decided every team absolutely must have one All-Star, and also, by the way, whoever in Major League Baseball is dragging their heels on having the DH in both leagues. I mean, did you see Herman and Chad Green try to hit last night? I mean, Herman just failing to bunt. It was a joke. So whoever's holding out on putting the DH in both leagues based on the absolute fiction that pitchers hitting creates compelling strategy, I mean, to quote the late Don Rickles, don't be a dumbbell. But you can add that mandate that every team must have an all-star to the pile of reasons why I would literally rather watch a dog bark for 3 hours than watch the All-Star game. But just as a final note, talking about snubs, another couple of Yankees who should have been, at the very least, on the fringes of the conversation for the reserve team are Don Giovanni, Gio Urshela, who had a big home run last night and is currently hitting .307, and Adam Ottavino, who, I mean, yes, he's had a few hiccups, including one on Tuesday at Citi Field, but he's also got an ERA of 1.91. He's been really, really reliable in general. But look, win the division, get to the series, and win there. That's really all that matters in the final analysis, not these dopey all-star committees and their stupid rules. And that'll do it for this week's episode of Bronx Bombers. Again, don't forget, you can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. Find us on Spotify. Follow us on Twitter @BombersPodcast is the handle. Like us on Facebook as well. And thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you again in a couple of weeks. Take care and happy 4th.